story about the little red engine who could? I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. That little red engine outshone all the bigger engines because of his optimism and his value of hard work. Mattie had that same optimism. Now, many of us in life have challenges, right? Have you said to yourself, I think I can, I think I can? Or are you like me and say, oh, that's too hard? Mattie Stepanek was not like that. Before the age of 11, he was a published author on the New York Times best-selling list. To tell Mattie's story, we have to talk about his mother's story a little bit. Mattie's mother, Jenny, got married at the ripe old age of 25. And when she and her husband had their first child about a year later, they had a daughter. The daughter was born 4 weeks prematurely, and she was not breathing. They rushed her out of the room and into a special unit, and they cared for her. And although Katie was eventually able to walk and to talk, she could not breathe without a ventilator. Katie survived until she was about 20 months old, and then her bladder and her kidneys stopped working, and she died. During that year, Jenny and her husband were expecting their second child. Their second child, Stevie, was born just 2 short months after Katie had passed away. And he seemed to be a healthy baby boy. But 3 days after his birth, his heart started to fail. And 3 months later, he too was on a ventilator. Now the doctors had told Katie and her husband Jenny and her husband that Katie's death was a fluke of nature. But as Stevie was getting sick as well, they were not believing this. Stevie survived for 6 months, and he passed away when one of his oxygen tanks malfunctioned and he suffocated. Katie and her husband went back to the doctor, and the doctor assured them, no, this was just a coincidence. It was not something that would happen again. So Jenny and her husband decided to have one more child. Stevie was born a bouncing baby boy, but within a matter of a few hours, he turned into an ill little newborn. Jenny and her husband were beside themselves. They had endured more grief than any parents should. So Jenny went to emotional and genetic counseling. At the counseling, they did some testing on her, and they found that Jenny carried a gene with a genetic disorder. Now, the doctors assured her that this was extremely rare. In fact, it was so rare, it didn't even have a name yet. And they assured her that she had a 1 in 4 chance of passing that on to another child. But Jenny and her husband had already decided they were not going to have any more children. Their third son was Jamie, not Stevie. Stevie was the second son. And Jamie was a fairly happy little boy. About a year after his birth, Jenny discovered that she was pregnant again. And being devout Catholics, their only choice was to have the child. So Mattie was born in 1990. And within a short amount of time, Mattie too had the same genetic disorder. But the two little boys were best of friends, and they were happy despite their illnesses. However, Jenny ran herself ragged taking care of those two little boys, going back and forth to the hospital and then home, and to the hospital and home. And in 1992, the doctors noticed that Jenny, too, her health was failing as well. So they did more testing, and they discovered that she carried this genetic disorder that was so rare that only she and her children are the only people in the world to have this genetic disorder. It attacks the automatic nervous system, and your body temperature, your digestion, and your breathing can just suddenly go haywire for no explanation. Jamie was 3.5 years old when he died peacefully in his sleep. And at the advice of a well-meaning doctor, but very bad advice, Jenny put away all of Jamie's things. She put away his clothes and his toys and his books. The doctor said Mattie shouldn't see those things because it would be too hard for him. Well, Mattie, this loving little boy, suddenly turned into an agitated little boy. He started banging his head on the walls, screaming at the top of his lungs and tearing pages out of books. It was then that Jenny just realized that the doctor's advice was bad. So she sat down and wrote a story called The Very Special Brother. She sat down with Mattie and they read the story of Jamie's life. They laughed together, they cried together, and they talked about how sad they felt that Jamie was gone. And Mattie started to express his own thoughts at that time. So Jenny wrote all of Mattie's thoughts down and put them into a book. And that was the start of his poetry career. Mattie wrote his first poem for his mom at the age of 4 years old. I give my mommy buried treasure, just like the little boy in Peter Pan. But I can't give my mommy buried Jamie. He is in the heaven. That is the hole in the ground, like a treasure. Now, Mattie survived this disorder for much longer than any of his siblings. However, he was still a vulnerable little boy. He attended Main Street School, and the children and the mothers of the children at the school were afraid to allow Mattie to play with any of them for fear that they might hurt him. So Mattie was everybody's buddy, but he was nobody's friend. But that didn't stop his optimism. He was still optimistic and hopeful for the future. When Mattie was 10 years old, he slipped into a coma, and he stayed there for 3 weeks. He almost died. When he came out of the coma, Mattie had just 3 wishes. His first wish was to publish a volume of his book of poetries. Mattie published that book before the age of 11. And in fact, he went on to write 7 more books that were all on the New York Times best-selling list before the age of 13. Mattie wanted to meet the former president, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was Mattie's hero. When he was 6 years old, he did an essay about Jimmy Carter, and he did the different stages of Jimmy Carter's life. And with each of those stages, he dressed the part. When he was the farmer, he put on farm clothes. And when he was the president of the United States, he put on a 3-piece suit. He loved Jimmy Carter for his peacemaking and for his leadership. So Jimmy Carter heard about Mattie's condition and surprised him with a visit. Mattie's mom, Jenny, later said that was the only time she ever saw him speechless. And the third wish was to appear on the Oprah Winfrey Show. Mattie wrote this poem when he was 11 that was published in his book called Heart Songs. He coined the phrase about peace and optimism, and this poem is in that book. Let this truly be a celebration of a new year. Let us remember the past, yet not dwell in it. Let us fully use the present, yet not waste it. Let us live for the future, yet not count on it. Mattie had wisdom beyond his years. He appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show just a few short weeks after 9/11. Now, I first saw Mattie when I saw him on the Jerry Lewis Muscular Dystrophy Telethon a few years ago. And he had this infectious smile. His bright, shining eyes just lit up the room, and he had more optimism than the whole room could feed off of it. And after his appearance on the Oprah Winfrey Show, Mattie was inundated with offers for interviews at newspapers and televisions. And he was offered to do motivational and inspirational speaking. Mattie spent the rest of his life traveling around the country, doing motivational speeches, inspirational speeches, meeting presidents and queens and kings and rock stars. And he never lost his optimism. His world was always the glass is half full, and he was going to fill it up as much as he could. Mattie passed away in May of 2004. And when he passed away, former President Jimmy Carter gave the eulogy. He talked about their friendship and how they met. And he talked about all of the letters they had written back and forth to one another. And he showed an inch-thick stack of letters that he and Mattie had shared. They talked about politics and religion and world events. Mattie was wise beyond his years. The president had one favorite poem of Mattie's that he had written when he was 13. A champion is someone who overcomes challenges, even when it requires creative solutions. A champion is an optimist, a hopeful spirit, someone who plays the game even when the game is called life, especially when the game is called life. As I said, Mattie went on to publish 7 books of poetry. This is one of them that's here at the library, and I recommend that you check them out. He did more in his 14 years on this life. He actually died just 3 weeks shy of his 14th birthday than some of us do in a lifetime. And he did it with dignity and with style, and always optimistic. Mattie wrote, "I choose to live until death, not spend the time dying until death occurs." Mattie Stepanek was definitely the little boy who could, but actually the little boy who did.